You might ask, what would be the first couple of steps in creating a disaster recovery plan or a strategy? And I think it's very critical that two things have to happen to have a successful plan and the ability to execute against it. One is an executive buy-in. So you have to have a sponsor at the executive level that's willing to spend money, time, and resources to develop a plan. If your plan is to say a prayer and move to Florida after the disaster, that's fine. You don't have to do a lot of planning for that. If the plan is to actually recover the business and keep running in the face of a disaster and to communicate the crisis to your customers, then you'd better plan and practice that. So executive sponsorship gives you two things. One, it gives you the ability to pay for the resources required to do it, which are not always going to be free or even cheap. But if you think about what are the costs of being down, what are the costs of being offline, what are the costs of having a crisis in communications to your customers, those costs can impact the ability to survive for a business. We've seen research over the years that as many as half the customers that have experienced a disaster don't remain in business. In other words, they get bought by someone else, they can't maintain their customer base, and a bad plan is just as bad as not having a plan. So executive sponsorship, having the funds and resources available to do it, are two of the first steps. From there, the key is to understand what the business requirements are, and to then develop a plan for recovery from the types of disaster. You don't have to lay down a risk-based disaster plan that considers every single kind of risk. What you should look at is a plan that keeps it simple, so that if your building is not available, if your network is not available, if your people are not available, you have plans to deal with all that. You don't have to determine the difference whether you're going to have a measles outbreak or some other sort of pandemic and get into the individual risks. But if your building is gone, that could be from a variety of different causes, or your building is not accessible. That reduces the number of variables that you have to plan for, and just looks at the fact that your building might not be there. How would you work remotely or from offices at home? And what would be the requirements to do that? So that helps you develop what are the requirements and the scope of what you have to do for your DR plan. When we created our work group recovery offers 12 years ago, the strategy was that would enable people to go to a workplace facility where they would have computers, telephones, a place to sit that was warm and had power, so that they would have an office to work at to continue to do their job, assuming that their building was gone for whatever reason. And that was a very simple process that wasn't always available. If you had to install new phone lines, it could take as long as 6 weeks to do that at that particular point in time. And so having the ability to get back up and run within a few hours was a strategy that would deal with a building issue. And those plans really resulted from the aftermath of 9/11. Prior to 2001, 9/11, there wasn't a lot of experience with broad-scale disasters that people had had in the U.S., where they wouldn't have not access to their building, they wouldn't have access to transportation, they couldn't use their phones, you couldn't fly anywhere for 3 days. And so that really was a learning experience for a lot of organizations in the disaster recovery space that said you had to have resources and capabilities within driving distance so that you could get to the facility that you were supposed to go working at. If you couldn't use the trains, you couldn't use airplanes, flying to Boise, Idaho to do a DR plan really wasn't going to work. So we had to have things local, we had to have those resources available, and the ones that really survived and the learnings out of businesses that survived out of 9/11 were people that had practiced their disaster recovery plans and exercised them.